So when you get into hands-on work, one of the first things that will usually come up is, what is the scientific method? Is there such a thing? Generally, we would say that there isn't one specific kind of scientific method. The scientific method is often a collection of many different approaches. An astrophysicist would approach the science that they do in a slightly different way from what a biologist, an ecologist might do. And so really the scientific method as a collective term is really more of a scientific mindset, that evidence is important, that you have to systematically collect observations, measured data, that the weight of evidence is always far more important than just because you believe something in your gut that it must be true. Sometimes in science, your observations or findings can actually be quite counterintuitive. You may think, you may assume, or you may have a hypothesis that something is the way it is, but when you actually conduct the investigation and you collect the data, you may find that your hypothesis wasn't correct. The data will be much more important to consider. So I want to introduce you to a pretty interesting little device. This is a microbial fuel cell. What it is a device that allows you to draw electricity from living cells. It's a pretty fun little device to tinker with because it really is just two chambers separated by a membrane. You fill in some chemicals, put in a living thing, feed it with something, and you get electricity out of it. There's plenty of opportunity to play around with the components, and when you do, you're able to actually change or vary the amount of electricity you get out of it. So it's actually a challenging activity to find ways and means to boost the electricity you can gain from this little device. It's actually a pretty old concept. In 1910, Michael Porter discovered the principle by putting together what we call a Porter cell. He demonstrated the effect, but because there was not enough understanding, it just seemed like magic. The exact processes, how it worked, wasn't very well known. So the technology languished for a very long time. It was only in the middle of the 20th century, the space race, that interest in fuel cell technology reignited. But because we still haven't gotten to the point where we fully understand how a microbial fuel cell works, I think it's so powerful as a teaching tool. Because when you engage with a microbial fuel cell, you're not looking at textbook knowledge. It's not in the textbook. So there's actual genuine potential to break new ground with this when you, as a student, play around with it. So one simple form of a microbial fuel cell just basically requires two chambers separated by a membrane. We fill these two chambers with the appropriate chemicals, put in the microbe, in this case a yeast, put in a sugar to feed the yeast, and we would be able to measure electricity from the electrodes. Now, in a microbial fuel cell, we're just making use of certain basic chemical processes to, in effect, steal some of those energetic electrons from within a living cell and pass it out to the external circuit. Probably the simplest way to recreate a microbial fuel cell is to just go back to the cell that Michael Porter made in 1910. Two carbon electrodes, one of them in the solution that's within the beaker, and the other electrode is inside the membrane bag that contains the yeast, the sugar, and a very special component known as an electron mediator. I'm going to put in a sugar here, in this case glucose. Now this is methylene blue, which is the chemical with which we will steal electrons from within the yeast cell. It kind of works like an electron taxi. The final component would be to add in the yeast. Yeast is a living organism. It consumes sugars to feed itself. So this is just simple baker's yeast. Once the carbon electrode is in all the way, I will just squeeze out any excess air and then apply a little rubber band to make sure that it's watertight. Put this into the beaker and pour in the oxidizing agent. And if you were to take a voltmeter, you would immediately be able to detect the voltage. 0.25 volts is not a lot. A standard AA size battery produces 1.5 volts. But you know what? In my experience, working with school students, by simply tinkering around with a microbial fuel cell, playing around with the components, and conducting simple investigations, have been able to produce microbial fuel cells that put out over 0.9 volts. If you've got microbial fuel cells like this, you can actually set up a very simple investigation. Set identical fuel cells up, and you just change one thing. For example, you could try the effect of putting different sugars into each microbial fuel cell. Which sugar does the yeast prefer? How do we know whether it prefers it or not? How do we know whether the yeast can make use of the sugar or not? We have a very simple measure. It's the voltage output of the cell. If the yeast is actively consuming the sugar and consuming it well, it will output a certain voltage. If it isn't, that voltage will fall. If it's doing it better, that voltage may actually rise by a little bit. There's still certain things that are not entirely understood about how it works. There's actually plenty of scope for even yourself, a student, to try out stuff, to experiment, to investigate how you can actually improve the voltage output of this little thing. So you have to get over this idea that there's only one way to do things, that there's only one way to put together a device, that there's only one way to conduct a particular investigation, that there's only one fixed answer to a particular question. If you approach things that way, then there can never be innovation. There can never be ideas that go beyond, because you're just stuck with what's already there. What you need to do is sometimes just let your mind drift and then think about, what if you did something differently? What are your assumptions that might not actually be true? When you innovate, you're finding new applications for sometimes nothing more than existing technology, something that's already there, or just applying something that you already know in just that little bit different way. So when you take apart something, when you tinker with it, it's no longer a black box to you. It's no longer something that just performs a particular scripted function. Very often, people who are really good at doing something make the best use of their tools. If you really understand how they work, how they function, what they can do. Because understanding what they can do and how they go about doing it gives you the ability to then think about what else they could be used for. It empowers you to push them even further. So the other part about the scientific method, or the way I think of it, the scientific mindset, is really that once you've got the data and once you've verified it for yourself, then the next most important step is to make sure that you share it with the world. Science is a collective endeavor. It doesn't just happen with that kind of stereotypical view of a scientist sitting alone somewhere in his laboratory working his own little thing. Scientific knowledge is only really developed when it is shared. Each scientist in any given discipline or specialization within science would actually be working on information that other scientists have discovered and then published. This kind of information sharing is at the very crux of what science is. Science is ultimately a social endeavor. So, talking about Galileo, aside from making his own telescopes, he actually made use of another technology of the day, and that was the printing press. That's what made him a really great scientist, because after he made his observations and he analyzed them, he wrote about them. And he didn't just write about them and put them away somewhere. He published his findings in the form of books. And that dissemination of what he found was really important in disseminating that knowledge throughout the rest of Europe and then the rest of the world. So that period in which Galileo worked, the Renaissance, the reason it's so important and so famous is because all the scientists of the day were working together. They were sharing what they knew. They built on each other's work. And that's what made it endure. We must always remember how anything that is known, anything that we know, we must always understand where its place is in the bigger scheme of things. What's the big picture? How does all of this fit together? Let me ask you this. What's the purpose of a flower? We all learned this in primary school. And if it took you a little bit more than a few moments to say, well, the flower is the reproductive part of a plant, then you know what I mean when I say that we don't always think about what we know and the purpose or function of something, for example, and how that relates to the bigger picture. I routinely ask this question, and I'm still surprised that many people don't readily know the answer. And even if they could say it had something to do with pollination and something to do with birds, and eventually come out with the answer that it's got something to do with reproduction, then usually my next question can very often be met with blank stares. How does a fruit relate to a flower? A fruit develops from a fertilized flower. After a flower's been pollinated, it grows into a fruit. Again, this is something that you learn in school, but we don't often make use of that information. We don't connect it with the real world. David Attenborough, the eminent naturalist, once said, many people tend to think of flowers as being there to gladden our hearts. We don't think very hard when we think sometimes the answer is really obvious or something really basic. So flowers have a function beyond the aesthetic pleasure they give us. The better we understand the basic science in the everyday, the science of the world around us, the better we would be able to see the potential, the better we would be able to make connections with what we know. It's these little pieces of knowledge, the little building blocks, that are really the fuel for scientific innovation.